Good morning, Legacy Bible Church. Thank you for joining us. I have another instance where Paul is referencing spiritually spoken worship in the book of Romans, and this is number 12. And it is at Romans 6:5, the first part of 5. And then there's another one in the second part of 5, and you'll see that as you look at it. Next week we'll talk about that. But Romans 6:5a. For if we have become ones united together in the likeness of his death. So when you become one together, united in the likeness of his death, that's when you are setting your mind aside in order to allow the utterances to flow through your organs of speech. So right there, highlight it in your Bible, make it a color so that every time you hear one of these and you're in your Bible, you're looking at it and you say, wait a second, that Robin, Steve, Legacy Bible Church, they're telling me that is spiritually spoken worship. Highlight that and watch how much it starts to make sense as you start looking at all these different places in the Bible and you plug that in and you're like, oh my gosh, that makes so much sense. So these are very simplistic teachings based on very deep exegesis. This is the verse. Starting here, this is the commentary. Going on over here, about 7 more pages of this commentary. So I give you a little tiny brief snippet. If you want more information, email Steve, steve.goodall@lbcdfw.org. And I'll put up his email address in the bottom left of the screen. He would love to talk with you about that. So if you've got questions, make sure that you reach out to him. He's going to come in and he's going to start his teaching on James, the second part. Thank you for joining us today.
All right. Good morning, Legacy Bible Church. Today I'm going to go through the second passage in the first chapter of the book of James. Last week I did the first passage, verses 2 through 12 of chapter 1. And that passage was titled Jesus and Receiving the Crown of Life. And I hope that you were able to listen to it. If you didn't listen to it, my recommendation is this. Go back and listen to them in sequences. These are going to be successive teachings. So I'm going to assume that you've listened to the previous teachings when I'm talking about the current teaching. And that would include, by the way, the teaching that I did at the beginning of October, which was kind of an umbrella context for the situation of James. Give the historical context into which James was writing the letter of James. Why did he write? What was the church situation that he was involved within that motivated him to write the letter of James? So all that's important to all of the teachings that I'm going to do in the book of James. And the teaching last week on the first passage, verses 2 through 12 in chapter 1, is very much a pretext that is necessary to understand then going in now to the second major passage, which is verses 13 through 27. It's the remainder of chapter 1. And this week, we've titled Moses and Doers of the Law. Doers of the Logos Word, I guess is how it would be titled there. Moses, doers of the Logos Word. And so what James, the brother of the Lord, is doing here in chapter 1 is he is not necessarily contrasting, but he's highlighting the two covenants, that there's continuity between the new covenant in Jesus Christ and the old covenant, the old Mosaic covenant. He didn't call it the old covenant. That was just the covenant that God had with the Israelites, the Mosaic covenant, Torah, the law of God. And so James' entire literary purpose in writing the letter of James was to highlight the continuity between the Mosaic covenant and the new covenant in Jesus. And he's doing that in chapter 1. So in the first passage, he highlighted the new covenant. Jesus as receiving the crown of glory, and does very much about, and this will be a surprise to some who are following the teaching where we teach the two dimensions of God's salvation plan. It'll be a surprise to a lot of people that James, who's promoting continuity with Torah, was an advocate of the end purpose of God's new covenant salvation plan. Yes, speaking in tongues. James, the brother of the Lord, was an advocate of that. He promotes that, but he had a different understanding of the end purpose of God's salvation plan in the new covenant than Paul had. And that is going to be very much the crux of the teaching through this study on the book of James. So I'm going to begin right now. Robin talked about my commentary. This is my commentary on James. It's about 250 pages of single space text, and I'm going to call it virtually publish ready. I've been through it a couple of times now. Actually, the PhD seminar I'm just now completing is on the book of James. Gave me a great opportunity to go all the way through my commentary and make not corrections, but revisions, what I call emendations, improvements to the explanation of the text, the teaching on James, which that's what an exegetical commentary is. It is an explanation of what the text means. What did the author mean when he wrote what he wrote? Why is he writing? And what does it mean? What does he expect his readers to get out of what he wrote? You never want to read into the text, meaning that the author did not intend. So the very definition of exegesis is to draw out of the text what the author meant and what the author wants his readers to know and to understand. And so that's what this commentary does. And that's the purpose of all of our teaching here at Legacy Bible Church, is to exegete the scriptures, to teach, to draw out of the scriptures what the New Testament authors meant when they wrote, and to bring that to our listening audience. And so I'm going to begin today with my introduction to this passage, verses 13 through 27, the second major passage in the book of James that we're calling today on the teaching that you've seen on the internet here, Moses, Doers of the Law. And so this is going to be my introductory passage, and I'm going to read this. I don't usually do this. I'm going to do this because I consider this a good introduction to expositing or teaching on this second passage in James. And so I'm just going to read it. That's going to make it a little easier on me and give me confidence that we're going to capture the essence here for the introduction. And you're going to hear some tie-in with last week's teaching, some tie-in to the historical context. So it helps as a little bit of a review as well as a good introduction for today's teaching. So here we go. Reading from my exegetical commentary on James, the introduction, to give you an introduction to today's teaching. The literary purpose of the letter from James was to respond to the early reports that had quickly reached Jerusalem concerning the Apostle Paul's teaching to the Gentiles in South Galatia. In other words, James wrote primarily to oppose any teaching that would in any way serve to downgrade or degrade the efficacy of the Old Covenant law of Moses, Torah, to ameliorate the sin problem of the Jews. Accordingly, the second major section of the letter from James marks the beginning of a direct response to Paul, who was teaching that the Israelites had always been under a certain deception concerning the law of Moses, the false belief that to obey Torah was to attain to the righteousness of God. And you can compare Romans 9, chapter 9, verses 30 and 31 for that aspect of Pauline theology. So Paul was teaching that the law of Moses was given not that the Israelites might do the law and attain to the righteousness of God, but that they might know their utter sinfulness before God. Some 9 years after James penned his letter in circa AD 48, Paul would write in early AD 57 what he called my good message. And that's a direct quote from Romans, where he cites in Romans 2 times, in Romans 2:16 and 16:25, he calls the letter of Romans my good message, my euangelion, my gospel. That's what Paul called Romans, wherein he would articulate explicitly and succinctly the aspect of his teaching that so inflamed the Jews of the diaspora and subsequently the Jewish leaders at Jerusalem. This is quoting from Paul in Romans 5:20. This is really the essence. Paul gives it to us here in Romans 5:20, the essence of what absolutely inflamed the Jews when he began teaching in his first missionary journey in South Galatia. So Paul writes, now the law entered alongside in order, and that is alongside the new covenant. The law entered alongside in order that the transgression might increase. So it's out of this thematic axiom of Paul's teaching, which is certainly reflected in Paul's immediate response to James' letter back in AD 48 when he wrote Galatians. It's all reflected there also, that James begins his diatribe against Paul here in the passage that we're going to study today with a prohibition, which serves to introduce the necessity for continued obedience to the law of Moses, where James writes, let no one be tempted to say, I am being tempted from God, for God is untemptable with respect to evil, and he himself tempts no one. That's James 1:13. In modern New Testament studies, this type of paranetic literature or literary term of moral instruction, in modern New Testament studies, paranesis is a literary term for moral instruction in terms of its social function. This letter from James is a paranetic letter. It's a moral instruction to the Jewish Christians in the diaspora in response to this teaching they're now receiving from James, that they're just now hearing about back in Jerusalem. I'm going to jump to the end of this. Of course, the report from the diaspora Jews of South Galatia did not accurately reflect the actual teaching of Paul. Rather, the paranesis of James, in other words, the letter of James, is responding to the distortion about Paul's teaching that was already being propagated by the Jews, especially the Judaized Christians in South Galatia, some of whom Paul had already identified in a meeting not 2 years earlier in Jerusalem as false brethren. That's in Galatians 2:4, who not coincidentally demanded anonymity lest they be seen by the Jews as sympathizers of the way, which effectively placed a shroud of secrecy over the meeting in Jerusalem that Paul talks about in chapter 2 of Galatians. The newly emergent problem for James and the Jewish Christians in Judea was that Paul's teaching had now become a public spectacle in South Galatia, which was certain to become a flashpoint for renewed persecution, not least against his own, that would be James, against his own faith community in Jerusalem. James' letter was intended to not only disown, but even renounce the teaching of Paul, and thereby give cover to Jewish Christians who remained members in good standing of the synagogue, that is, obedient to Moses. In short, James 1:13 serves as an opening salvo against the apostolic mission from Paul. So with that, Robin, I'm going to ask you to bring up the first passage, and we will get started here. First passage, verses 13 through 16. You have it? This is a prohibition passage. I want you, as I read this, I want you to hear that he starts here with a prohibition. Do not say, and do not be deceived. I want you to hear that in this passage. Let no one being tempted say, I am being tempted from God. For God is untemptable with respect to evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each one is tempted by his own lust, thusly being dragged away and enticed. Then the lust, being seized, gives birth to sin, and the sin, being fully formed, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. So you see how James wraps this opening passage with two prohibitions. Do not say that God deceives. Do not be deceived, my brothers. This is an opening salvo against the Pauline mission. What's he doing? Paul has gone into the diaspora synagogues, and according to the Jews' perception and the communication they're bringing back to Jerusalem, Paul is deceiving the Jews, particularly Jewish Christians in this new sect called the Way, the followers of Jesus Christ. He's telling them, according to this message coming back, that they can essentially forsake Moses, forget about Moses, which, to be truthful in the whole teaching of Paul, that's pretty much what Paul was teaching. But he wasn't teaching it to denigrate Moses. He was teaching it to say Moses is fulfilled. His time in the special purposes of God's salvation plan, the dispensation of Moses is complete. It's fulfilled. It's finished. There's a new dispensation in Jesus Christ. That was Paul's message. But of course, all the Jews heard was, oh my gosh, he's saying Moses is finished. Everything we have identified with as Jews, everything we have held as sacred, our very position as the covenant people of God is being forsaken, being rejected here by this teaching of the apostle. That's what they heard. That's the message they took back to Jerusalem. Not that the Messiah has come, the Mosaic covenant is fulfilled. We now have a new covenant in the Messiah, Jesus Christ. They didn't have ears to hear that. All they heard was Moses is being rejected. So what James is starting with here to the diaspora Jews, he is saying, do not say that God tempts, because they were saying part of Paul's teaching was that the only purpose of the law of Moses was to increase transgressions. May it never be that, to them, that was just anathema. It's one of the reasons they stoned Paul in Lystra. And so James starts his second passage here where he is making a direct response to this teaching from Paul in the diaspora. And he's telling the Jews, don't ever say God tempts. The law of Moses cannot be to increase transgressions. Don't ever say that. God does not tempt. And he finishes his passage again. His sights are squarely on Paul and on Paul's teaching. And he finishes this passage by saying, do not be deceived, brothers, by this teaching. You'll recall from the teaching last week, I talked about that right up front when the very first statement in the earlier passage, you don't have to put this up, Robin, I'm just as a quick review. Verse 2, consider it all joy, my brothers, whenever you might fall into various temptations, knowing that the testing of your faith produces perseverance, and let the perseverance have a perfect effect, in order that you might be perfect and whole, lacking in nothing. And there, the various temptations, again, was an allusion to this deception by this teacher, Paul, that was going through the diaspora into the synagogues with this newfangled teaching to deceive the Israelites to forsake Moses. And that's what he was pointing to in the earlier passage that we talked about last week. And that's what he's addressing squarely now, as he is going to essentially defend the law of Moses. Okay, let's go to the second passage, Robin, the Logos, word of truth. This is a passage of truth. Okay, the first passage was prohibition. The second passage in the major section here on Moses, the second passage is going to be a propositional passage on truth. And then you'll see in the next one is going to be an affirmative imperative passage. So you have in the first three passages, you have what not to do, don't do this, the first passage. The second one that we're going to read here is just a propositional statement of truth. And then the one that follows is going to be an affirmative imperative passage. I told you what not to do. I've given you truth. Now here's what you need to do. That'll be the next passage. But right now, we're now in the second passage with a propositional statement of truth. So verse 17, every agathos, good giving, and every perfect gift is from above, descending from the Father of lights, beside whom there is within no variation or shadow of turning. Being determined, he brought us forth by the Logos, word of truth. For us, he's speaking to Jews here, for us to be a certain kind of first fruits of his creations plural. Okay, so let's walk through this and let you hear the essence of this propositional truth that James is speaking to the Israelites, who he has just basically commanded in the prohibition. Don't say that God is deceiving, according to this Pauline teaching that you may have heard. Don't ever fall into that. Don't be deceived. And now he gives the truth. Every agathos, good giving, and perfect gift is from above. I'm going to tell you briefly, and this has been developed in great detail exegetically, but I'm not going to go through all the complicated exegesis for these meanings. I'm just going to basically give you the meaning. But I want you, if you have questions about anything that I teach here, you want more depth, you want more detail, please email me. Let's communicate about it. And I would love to have that conversation with anyone. Steve, how did you develop this? Or you said this, and I'd like to know how you developed that meaning. What does that mean? I'd be glad to have that conversation with you. But for here, I'm gonna go fairly quickly through this passage just for the sake of time. I want to cover this in the time I have today and get all the way to verse 27. I'm going to move pretty quickly, just giving you the high level of what the meaning is. Okay, so every agathos, good giving, and every perfect gift is from above. What is James saying there? He uses agathos, good, and that contrasts with kalos, good, which he uses several other places. He uses agathos, good, very much in the same context that Paul does. It's referring to the intrinsic goodness of God. Agathos, good, is always a God kind of good, reflecting the very nature of God. God is agathos, good, regardless of anything, whether anyone knows it or not, whether someone agrees or disagrees with it or not, doesn't matter. God is just agathos, good, period. That's the meaning of agathos. And James holds to that meaning here also. And so the agathos, good gift, good giving, I should say, good giving refers the act of giving. And the word is dosis, and it refers the act, or it emphasizes the act of giving. So I don't call it every agathos good gift. I use the word giving to differentiate from the next word he's going to use, dorema, which infers the fact of giving. So one is the act of giving, and the other one is just the thing, the gift itself. And so I differentiate that here by calling one a giving and the other a gift. I hope that makes sense to you, but that's a good way of differentiating between the two different words for gift that are used here. One emphasizing the act, the other emphasizing just the fact. Okay, so the agathos good giving is pointing directly to God giving Torah to Moses and God giving human beings the ability to receive Torah, Moses, which the Jews considered a matter of the heart. It's not only an intellectual knowledge, but it's receiving from the heart, and that always infers obedience. So when he refers to every agathos good giving, he is referring to the intrinsic God kind of goodness of the law of Moses, of Torah. And then when he refers after that to every perfect gift from above, that goes right back to the teaching last week, where in verse 4, he said, "Let the perseverance have a perfect effect in order that you might be perfect and whole, lacking in nothing." When you participate in the end purpose of God's salvation plan, James is saying that that's where God will have a perfect effect. And that is what he is referring to here in verse 17 as every perfect dorema, fact, gift is from above. And so we talked about last week, and I'll just mention briefly here again, that meaning in verse 4, that every perseverance will have a perfect effect. James' meaning in that is that the edification that you get from participating in the end purpose of God's salvation plan is always going to have the effect of making better or perfected, if you will, followers of Moses. It's very different than the Pauline context for the end purpose of God's salvation plan and the edification that is received from participating in the end purpose. Paul and James have different ideas about that edification. In the Jamesian context, that edification is always going to be for the purpose of making Christians better followers of Moses. And so in verse 17, when he mentions every perfect gift, that is those events of edification to make followers of Moses better followers of Moses. That's the purpose in the Jamesian theology. The purpose of the end purpose of God's salvation plan in Christ, the new covenant, is to make Christians better followers of Moses. That's what all of this is geared toward. Every agathos good giving, that is Torah given to Moses, and understanding of Torah and passion for Torah given to a human being. That's every good giving. And then every perfect gift is the edification out of participating in the new covenant and purpose of God's salvation plan. That's verse 17, which is to make you a better follower of Moses, which God established as his agathos good giving. It's what makes a follower of Moses. And every perfect gift from above is the edification that comes from participating in the end purpose of God in Christ Jesus. the edification. Every perfect gift is to make you a better follower of Moses, is to perfect that initial work to make you a better follower of Moses. That's Jamesian theology. And he says, descending from the Father of lights. Lights is plural here, so that the giving of the law and the edification is where the plurality comes in. So every agathos good giving and every perfect gift from above, that's why the plural lights, each one referring to a relative light. One is the giving, the other is one is the agathos good giving, the other is the perfect gift that I just explained. And that's where you get the plural in the reference to the Father of lights, beside whom there is within no variation or shadow of turning. Now, I will just say briefly that phrase has been subjected to all sorts of various distorted meanings and interpretations. But James has a simple meaning here. His simple meaning here, again, relating to what he considers a deception that Paul is teaching in South Galatia, that Paul is taking to the synagogues in the diaspora, that Moses is finished, is through, forsake Moses, is now just Jesus Christ, which is true, but being taken out of context here by the Jews. James is saying here, the Father of lights, in whom there's no variation or turning. His inference there is God, in whom there is no variation, would not forsake Moses. And you remember last week we also said reference to the one giving singularly to all. That's in verse 5. But if any of you lacks wisdom, let him petition God, the one giving singularly to all, and not reviling, and it will be given to him. You recall there we talked a lot about that term, that what God gives is singular. He doesn't give something in an old covenant to the Jews different from what he gives in new covenant going to the Gentiles. God is singular. He doesn't have that kind of conflict within himself. And so he's saying the same thing here in verse 17, at the end of verse 17, when he says, beside whom there is within no variation or shadow of turning. It goes right back to where he said in verse 5, the one giving singularly to all. There's no variation within him. What God gives, he gave Moses Torah to give to the Israelites and to basically compel the Israelites to become obedient to in order to remain in covenant with God. James' entire emphasis in his letter here, whether it's verse 4, the singularity of God, or verse 17, the Father of lights, in whom there is no variation of turning, the inference there is God gave Moses Torah, and anything God gives to a human being is going to be consistent with Torah, is going to support Torah, is going to help human beings become obedient followers and doers of Torah. That's James' entire emphasis, church. And he demonstrated it in verse 1:4, demonstrates it again here at the end of verse 17, in whom there is no variation or shadow of turning. Verse 18, being determined, he brought us forth. He's talking to Jews here. Being determined, he brought us forth by the Logos word of truth. For us, the Jews, to be a certain kind of first fruits of his creations. So the Logos word of truth is a synonym for the law of Moses, for Torah. And so God, in his agathos good giving of Torah to the Jews, brought the Jews forth as he calls it a certain kind of first fruits of his creations plural. So that of his creations has in view the whole of his creations, which the inference here is the inclusion of the Gentiles. So that when he refers for us to be a certain kind of first fruits of his creations, he's saying we, the Jews who were given Torah as the agathos, good giving from God, are a certain kind of first fruits of his creations. We were here first. We were his creations by the giving of Torah and by our obedience to Torah, which he calls here the Logos, word of truth. Next passage, Robin. I'm trying to move along, but I'm trying not to move along too fast here. So for those of you that may have your head spinning a little bit with all these new interpretation, they're not new, it's actually restored interpretation. It's what James meant when he wrote, but it's been lost or corrupted by the church. So as you're hearing this restored understanding of what James actually meant, may be hard for you, and you may be receiving it in such rapid fire, it's hard to grasp it all. Two things you can do to help yourself. One is write things down as you hear them. Write them down. Just make bullet points and make notes of things that you're hearing that are new to you, surprising to you, that you want to recall again and not forget. Write it down. It's a very powerful learning tool. Then the second thing is go back and listen to the teaching again, even multiple times, and make notes, and you will begin to absorb these things and not be subject, as I often say, my thoughts ran away with my memory. And that's often the case. You hear something, and 5 minutes later, you know you heard something interesting. You just can't remember what it is or what it was, and you can't repeat it exactly. So write it down, listen to it again. That's how you absorb these things and can begin to remember them. So verse 19, this passage is called Receive the Implanted Logos Word. And this is the affirmative imperative passage. This is where now James is entering into telling you what to do. And he'll do it in two passages. The first one has to do with knowing, and the second passage we'll talk about next has to do with doing. So verses 19 through 21 is the imperative passage of knowing. And I title this passage, Receive the Implanted Logos Word. So he says, know this by your own experience, my beloved brothers, and let each anthroman be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. For the anger of an andre man does not produce the righteousness of God, on account of which, putting aside all vulgarity and profusion of malice, in gentleness receive the being able to save your souls, implanted Logos word. There's a lot packed into that passage there, as in all of the passages, and it'll be this way all the way through James. There's huge meaning packed into everything James is writing here. It all is promoting continuity and faithfulness to Moses. If you keep that in mind all the way through, that's going to help you a lot to understand what James is writing about. So he says, know this in verse 19, know this by your own experience. And this by your own experience is in italics. I add that because the verb here is oida. It's experiential knowledge. I don't want to get into a lot of detail about the grammar, but oida is always in the perfect tense, which always infers a past event or experience that has continuing effect in the present time. So it has in view, the verb oida always has in view that something happened in the past that created a a certain amount of knowledge, if you will, experiential knowledge that carries with the one who had the experience. And that's why it's always in the perfect tense. And man, I could do a whole teaching on just the verb oida with the perfect tense, but that's in a nutshell. So always has in view a past event that caused you to have some knowledge that carries with you after that event, that you have that knowledge because of having had that experience. So I want to capture that meaning here in verse 19. So I add this by your own experience. So know this by your own experience, my brothers. Otherwise, if it was just intellectual knowledge from somebody telling you or you reading something, he would have used the verb gnosko. He would not have used oida. Know this by your own experience, my beloved brothers. And let each anthroman be quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to anger. So what does he mean there? So anthroman contrasts with andreman. There's two different words for man. One is anthropos, the other is aner. And anthropos infers man by, how shall I say this, just the anthropology of man. The man is God's creation. Aner infers the anthroman, the anthropos, who has a certain kind of blessing. When an anthropos man has a blessing, he can be thought of as an aner. So often aner is to refer to an anthropos who becomes a husband to a wife. And the wife being considered a blessing on an anthropos man, he becomes aner. So that often aner translates best as just husband. When you hear husband used in the New Testament, it's probably coming from the Greek term aner. Now, another use for aner, very common, is for Jews. Jew is representative of an anthropos man who is in covenant with God according to Moses, according to Torah. A man who has received the Logos word of truth in the heart as a good agathos, good giving from God, and he is obedient to Moses, to Torah. That's the Jew who can then be referred to as an aner. And I translate that as andre man, and that just has to do with the grammar of the word aner when it goes into the other conjugations. Andre is a good transliteration. So I use anthroman for anthropos and andreman for aner to make that distinction between those two words. English translations historically have only translated both words as man, and so you lose the distinction in English translations. And I'd encourage you right here to go to your English translation and translate the word man in, go to verse 19, and where it says, and let each man be quick to hear, put anthro, A-N-T-H-R-O, anthro, circle that word man in verse 19 and put anthro with it. Just with your pen in the margin, put anthro and point to man there in verse 19. And in verse 20, take the word man, for the anger of a man does not produce the righteousness of God. Circle that man in verse 20 and put andre man. And that way you'll have that distinguish in your Bible between anthropos and aner as it is in the Greek text. It's a very important distinction. So that know this by your own experience, my beloved brothers, let each anthroman be quick to hear. The idea here is kind of has in view the Gentiles who are being evangelized in the diaspora into the salvation plan of God. And when they are evangelized into the salvation plan of God, beforehand, they're just anthropos. They're not yet blessed. And they become blessed when they hear the Logos word of truth. Moses, Torah, that's when. So the inference here is the Gentile, anthropos, who would hear the Logos word of truth, be quick to hear it, and out of hearing the Logos word of truth becomes essentially a proselytized Jew, a Gentile proselyte into Judaism. That's the inference here. And so that's the one that becomes then the aner. So he says, let the anthroman be quick to hear, slow to speak. We're going to talk about slow to speak, very important meaning there, and slow to anger. For the anger of an andre man does not produce the righteousness of God. Keep in mind here, Paul has been teaching in South Galatia, and the Jews of the diaspora synagogues have just exploded in anger against this new teaching. They stoned Paul to death at Lystra, and their anger is now coming back to Jerusalem and is threatening the church at Jerusalem, the church which is being led by James. So when he's saying here that the anger of an anthropos, or of an andre man, does not produce the righteousness of God, he is saying you're getting angered at this deceptive teaching that's coming to your synagogues in the diaspora, and it's inciting you to violence. And they often did that thinking that they were doing the will of God. When the Jews stoned Paul at Lystra, they probably thought they were doing the will of God. And James is saying here, the anger of an andre man cannot produce the righteousness of God. He's essentially saying here, when you're confronted with that heresy from this Apostle Paul, don't get angry about it. That's not going to work toward the will of God. So that's his meaning there. But what about when he says be slow to speak? So we know that be quick to hear means be quick to receive the implanted Logos word, to become followers of Moses. Be quick to hear, be slow to speak. And when he's talking there about speaking, he's talking about Torah. Be slow to presume to speak coherently, even as a teaching or a teacher about Torah. Be very careful with that. And you'll hear that a lot clearer as we move through the letter, especially in chapter 3 at the beginning, where he says, let not many of you become teachers, because teachers are subjected to a higher level of judgment. Let not many of you become teachers. So this becomes a consistent theme where he is concerned here when he says, be slow to speak. Again, he has in mind this heretical teaching that's going on in the diaspora, where Paul is bringing this newfangled teaching into the synagogues. He's saying, be quick to become obedient to Torah. Be very slow to presume to talk intelligently and be a teacher of Torah. Be very careful about that. And that's his meaning here with be quick to hear, be slow to speak. And finishing with, and slow to anger. For the anger of an andre man, right now, the presumption is that this is the one who has received the Logos word of truth, as a follower of Moses, hopefully is going to be very careful about ever presuming to teach about Moses. It requires a lot of training, a lot of expertise to be a teacher of Moses. Be very slow, and be very slow to anger. If you hear somebody breaking the law of Moses or rejecting or forsaking Moses, be careful. Be very careful about becoming indignant about that and angry and responding to that, because anger cannot, I mean, the law of Moses is about, in the Jewish context, is about producing the righteousness of God. That's what Moses is about. That's what Torah is about. It's about reproducing the righteousness of God here on earth. And he's saying becoming angry toward brother Jews who are forsaking Moses, or denigrating or misinterpreting or misusing Moses, becoming angry toward that is not going to accomplish the very thing that Moses is for, that Torah is for, which is to reproduce the righteousness of God. Anger is not going to do that. So that's his meaning here. He always has Paul in this teaching that's going through the diaspora in view here as he is writing this letter. If you make that correlation and keep that correlation in mind, it's going to bring a lot of meaning and a lot of context that James intended for his letter to have. This is why he wrote these things, and this is the context, this is the milieu, this is the occasion in which he's writing. This new teaching is going through the diaspora, going into the synagogues, getting the Jews up in arms, and that hostility is coming back to Jerusalem, where James is the leader of the church at Jerusalem, and the Jewish leadership is going to hold him accountable for what's going on through this teaching of Paul in the diaspora. And so James writes this letter to uphold and to affirm Moses, so that the Jews can know that Christianity, at least through the eyes, through the lens of James in his leadership role, is not forsaking Moses. That's his primary concern here. Verse 20, for the anger of an angry man does not produce the righteousness of God. Verse 21, on account of which, putting aside all vulgarity and profusion of malice, in gentleness receive the being able to save your souls implanted Logos word. He's basically saying there that receiving Moses is demonstrated through works of the law, which are going to be gentleness. It's going to be in gentleness that you obey Moses and do works of the law, not in anger, not lashing out like a stoned Paul at Lystra, but in gentleness doing works of the law. That's his exhortation about knowing. Okay, now he goes into the next passage, also positive exhortation on doing the law of Moses. So starting at verse 22, I'm going to read through this and then we'll back up and talk about it. Verse 22, but at the same time become doers of the Logos word, and not only hearers, deluding yourselves. Because if anyone is a hearer of the Logos word and not a doer, this one is like an andre man, there's that word again, andre man, observing his biological face in the mirror. For he observed himself and has gone away and immediately forgot what sort of man he was. Remember that distinction between anthroman and aner man, andre man. Has forgotten what sort of man he was. Verse 25. But the one stooping alongside the Logos word to look into the perfect law, the law of freedom, and continuing alongside the Logos word, not becoming a hearer of forgetfulness, but rather a doer of work, this one will be blessed in his doing. Do you hear that theme? Andre man and blessing. That's the whole context of andre man, being blessed. He's blessed not by being a hearer, but by being yes, it starts with hearing, quick to hear, but by being obedient, by being a doer of works of the law. So he says in verse 22, but at the same time become doers of the Logos word and not only hearers, deluding yourselves. Verse 23, because if anyone is a hearer of the Logos word and not a doer, This one is like an Andre. He's an Andre man, right? Because he has heard the Logos word, he has received it and claims to be a follower, obedient follower of Torah, of Moses. This Andre man is like an Andre man, and he's talking here about the Jew, the biological Jew, the descendant of Abraham, is like this Andre man observing his biological face in a mirror, for he observed himself and had gone away and immediately forgot what sort of man he was. In other words, the context here is you're a Jew. Don't forget who you are. You're a biological descendant of Abraham. When you look at yourself in the mirror, know this: you are a Jew in covenant with God. And how do you stay in covenant with God? By being a doer of works of the law. So when you think of yourself, and he uses the metaphor here of looking at yourself in a mirror and actually seeing an image of the physical man before you, know that that physical image of a man before you that you're seeing in a mirror is a biological descendant of Abraham, in covenant with God. You're from the circumcision. The men in your family are all circumcised in order to demonstrate physically on that physical man, on the physical body, that you're a keeper of Torah, you're a doer of works of the law. Don't ever forget that doing the law is everything with respect to staying in covenant with God and remaining that Andre man. Because it's in doing works of the law that you're blessed. It's in doing works of the law that you can call yourself Andre man, the blessed Anthro man, Andre man. The doers of works of the law are blessed because they do works of the law. Verse 25 is difficult. So know that going in and kind of stay with me on this. James is going back to the continuity of the new covenant with the Mosaic covenant here in this passage. So when he says, but the one stooping alongside the Logos word to look into the perfect law, I'm just going to give this to you so that you can establish this image. This is the one when he's stooping alongside. I want you to hear the one going all the way back to verse 9, when he said, let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation. I want you to bear that meaning in mind here, because that's the context here when he brings into verse 25. But the one stooping alongside the Logos word, this is the one that becomes a lowly brother. This is the dying to self church that you just heard Robin talk about this morning as the figure of speech in Romans 6:5a, when he said, if we will become united ones in the likeness of his death. That's exactly what James is meaning here. I tell you, there are some correspondences and parallels between James and Paul in that they both held to the end purpose of God's salvation plan. They just viewed it differently. The purposes of God are different in the Pauline view versus the Jamesian view. In the Jamesian view, the purpose of God is just that you become a better follower of Moses in your day-to-day living out in the world. In the Pauline view, the purpose is that you would become more and frequently a worshiper of God in spirit and truth and participate in that end purpose. Two different, very different purposes. The Jamesian purpose is how you do works of the law in this world, in this life. The Pauline view is that the purpose is that you will become and remain and enter back into, on a very frequent basis, the end purpose of God's salvation plan. Very different views. Jamesian view, how you live your life in this world. Pauline view is that the only place of righteousness is when you're dead to self, participating with God in that end purpose of God's salvation plan. So Jamesian view has in view the earthly end product here, how you act in your life. Pauline view has in view the heavenly end reality of participating with God in the end purpose of his salvation plan. Very different views of this end purpose of the salvation plan of God. Nevertheless, you're hearing James here in verse 25 making reference to the end purpose of God's salvation plan, the dying to self, the lowly brother boasting in his exaltation. This is the one, he says, the one stooping alongside the Logos word, meaning when you die to self, you are alongside the Logos word. You have died to that. It's not gone. You're just stooping alongside it. Do you see that imagery here? Moses is not gone dead. You're just stooping alongside Moses as you temporarily, in a punctiliar fashion, are peering in at verse 25, the Logos, to look into the perfect law, the law of freedom. That is referring to Jesus Christ. That's the passage we studied last week. Jesus Christ is the perfect one. Jesus Christ is the realm of the perfected law. That's what he's referring to here when he says, stooping down alongside the Logos word to look into the perfect law, the law of freedom. The book of John, if you want a passage that sort of supports this, is when Mary goes to the tomb in chapter 20 of the book of the Gospel of John. And Mary comes toward the empty grave, or toward the grave. It's not necessarily, we don't know it's empty at that moment, but it says she stoops down, Mary stoops down to look into the tomb. And that is a metaphorical reference to the dying to self in the Gospel of John. And it has exactly the same metaphorical reference here, the one stooping down alongside the Logos word to peer into the perfect law, or the perfect the perfect law. Yes, the law of freedom. And then part B here, and continuing alongside the Logos word, not becoming a hearer of forgetfulness, but rather a doer of work. So the idea here is that when you're a participant in the end purpose of God's salvation plan, and that temporary aspect completes, and you come back into your mind and your body, you continue then to be a doer of works of the law. Don't be what this heretical teacher in South Galatia is teaching the Jews and Jewish Christians and the new Gentile converts to forsake Moses and just follow and enter into this end purpose of God's salvation plan. He's saying, no. When you come out of that dying to self, you continue being a follower of Moses. This is his meaning in verse 25 here. James is acknowledging, again, just like he did in the first passage that I talked about last week, he's acknowledging the end purpose of God's salvation plan, but that the purpose of the end purpose of God's salvation plan is to make better followers of Moses. And you see that here. That's exactly what he's doing in verse 25. But the one stooping alongside the Logos word to look into the perfect law, the law of freedom, that's the dying to self, that punctiliar, temporary entering into the end purpose of God's salvation plan. And continuing then after that, continuing alongside the Logos word, not becoming a hearer of forgetfulness. Remember, it's out of that end purpose that has a perfect effect on you. That's the perfect gift that is from above. Every perfect gift from above is to edify you, to make you a better follower of Moses. This is Jamesian theology here. Not becoming a hearer of forgetfulness, but rather a doer of work. This one will become blessed in his doing works of the law, obedience to Moses. That's where the blessing comes from. That's where you tally up credits in the economy of heaven and God, that at the eschatological final judgment, your scales are going to be tipped in favor of having good things and less bad things, and you'll receive your final salvation. This is Jewish theology. This is Jamesian theology. The whole point and the whole purpose of the letter of James is to make sure that Christians become, if you're Gentile, become faithful to Moses, and Jewish Christians remain faithful to Moses, because that's where you tally up credits toward your salvation at the final judgment. Jamesian theology, church. We'll be talking a lot more about this in the coming weeks. I'm going to forego verse 27 or 26 and 27 this week because I want to do that justice, and I've given you enough this week. So I'm going to conclude here and ask that you contemplate on these things. I hope you've taken notes. I hope that you will listen to this teaching again. And I'll be back next week, and I'll pick up at verse 126. God bless you, and we'll see you then.